Hello, I am back for the Module 9 lecture. Uh, this lecture, we're going to be looking at ecosystems and the biosphere. And this is a great image to start with. This is from the Angel's Rest Trail, I believe. So up in the Columbia Gorge. And you can see the Columbia River off in the distance. You can see the forest on the south side of the Columbia River. And you can see some of the landscape that was burned during the Eagle Creek fire. So this is kind of a good case study in how ecosystems function and how human disturbance can have drastic effects on the ecosystem. I think this was started by a couple of teenagers lighting off fireworks, and the forest that had developed over hundreds of years had a major secondary succession event happen. But it is secondary succession because there are some living trees there. So, but what that means in terms of slope stability and sediment runoff into the waterways, and how that impacts the health of salmon and the health of the terrestrial organisms. That it's not very easy to predict how everything is going to respond in the face of such disturbance. So anyway, that's a good little intro to our chapter or this module. So here's the big ideas that we're going to try and cover. We're going to talk about the basic functions of ecosystems, how energy and nutrients move in these ecosystems, and the different trophic levels in these ecosystems and how much energy they get. We'll talk about biological magnification, or sometimes shortened to biomagnification, which is the accumulation of toxins in different trophic levels. We'll talk about some of the biogeochemical cycles, especially water, carbon, nitrogen, maybe a little bit about phosphorus. Probably we're going to skip sulfur in this lecture, but it's also kind of interesting. We will talk about terrestrial biomes, the kind of generalized ecosystem types that are found in similar abiotic conditions around the world. And then the last part of this is looking at aquatic and marine biomes, but I'm going to let the guest lecturer cover that. So, all right. So we're stepping up in our levels of organization. We're now looking at ecosystems. We moved to beyond communities, which are all the living organisms in a particular area. And now we are looking at ecosystems, which include the abiotic environment, in addition to those living communities. So it's the living organisms plus the soil, the water, the air, the different levels of nutrients in those different places. So, yeah, so that's kind of where we're building up to. And then next week, we'll maybe talk a little bit more about the biosphere. Okay, so how do ecosystems work? The one sentence version of that is that energy flows through an ecosystem while nutrients are cycling within it. So these are pictures we've seen before. If we think about the energy from the sun, a lot of it is being lost as heat, but some of it is captured by producers, those photosynthetic organisms like plants and algae and cyanobacteria. And then it could be transferred to consumers, namely animals, or maybe zooplankton, or other single-celled consumers. And eventually it all energy ends up in the hands of decomposers, the fungi, bacteria, worms, and so on. So that energy is constantly flowing, and eventually it's all going to end up as heat. But within those energy transfers, there is a cycling of nutrients. So we've already seen the link between aerobic cellular respiration and photosynthesis, which are linked together in the carbon cycle. These carbohydrates like glucose can get broken down into carbon dioxide and water, and this cycles back and forth. So those nutrients aren't going away, the atoms aren't disappearing. They are just being converted between different forms. Okay. The other kind of basic thing to think about in ecosystems are the trophic levels. So the base of the trophic pyramid would be the producers, which in aquatic ecosystems might be algae. Terrestrial ecosystems, it's usually plants. And they photosynthesize and make available energy and nutrients to the primary consumers, also called herbivores. And those would be mollusks in this example. And then organisms that eat the primary consumers, also known as first level carnivores. Those would be things like the slimy sculpin. And then one more level up, we could have our tertiary or apex consumers, the apex predators for this ecosystem, might be something like a Chinook salmon. And those have very few natural predators, at least until they get out to the ocean and encounter orcas. So, okay. So this is kind of a simple illustration of a quote unquote food chain. It's usually not so simple though, as we'll see in a few slides. If we look at the population levels and the biomass in these different trophic levels, we find an interesting pattern. And that is that only about 10% of the energy gets transferred to the next higher level. So if we look at the relative energy content in different trophic levels, the producers have 10 times more than the herbivores or primary consumers. And those have about 10 times more than the secondary consumers. And those might have about 10 times more than the tertiary consumers. So this is looking at a lake, looks like a lake ecosystem in Florida. But anyway, where does the rest of that energy go? Well, it's lost as heat. It's lost as the energy an organism uses to move itself around. It's lost in growth and reproduction. But ultimately, it's all going to end up as heat. Okay. So the interesting thing, because these bigger organisms have to eat more of the little ones to get enough energy, that allows for the accumulation of toxic chemicals or heavy metals or various poisonous substances at higher trophic levels. So if we look at the total concentration of PCBs, which are these nasty chemicals called polychlorinated benzenes, they might be at very low concentrations in the environment and not particularly concerning or toxic. But then because of the energy relationships between these trophic levels, and if those toxins are stored, and in particular, a lot of them like to be stored in fat tissues because they're non-polar molecules like these PCBs, the concentrations will increase throughout the trophic pyramid. So we have the trophic pyramid here. So the ones that are at the top are accumulating very high concentrations and potentially deadly concentrations of toxins. So this is important for human populations that might be eating some of these apex predators, like walleye in this example, or Chinook salmon in a more local example. Or you might have heard the recommendation that pregnant people should not be eating lots of tuna fish because tuna are an apex predator in the ocean and they can accumulate very high levels of mercury. Um, so, so it is something to be concerned about. And I should also mention that this has a disproportionate impact on indigenous populations that are, you know, they're part of their cultural heritage is eating a very high percentage of their diet being from salmon, right? So the environmental impacts of pollution oftentimes hit oppressed communities harder than the rest of the population. So, okay. So, so when we're talking about these trophic levels, we like to, you know, the old terminology was food chain, like just one thing eats another thing, right? Pretty simple, but nature is not that simple. Most of the time, these trophic interactions are organized into food webs, where we have producers that supply a wide variety of primary consumers or herbivores. And then those in turn have a suite of secondary consumers, and certain organisms might behave as both a primary and secondary consumer. A lot of birds will mostly eat seeds and nuts, but if they come across the wayward earthworm or another protein-packed morsel, like a bug, they're probably going to eat it, right? So there's the omnivore trophic category, which is kind of mostly maybe eats plant material, but then for calories, but then might eat some other consumers for protein sources. And then eventually the decomposers get to it all, right? Okay, so now we're going to switch gears and start looking at some, you know, step away from the communities for a second and look at the biogeochemical cycles in different, or for different elements, right? Or different nutrients. So the water cycle, hopefully you're familiar with this. Being in Portland, you are probably familiar with precipitation, water falling out of the sky. How did it get there? Most likely it was evaporation that was occurring over the oceans. That evaporation, that water vapor condenses into clouds and then hits land, and especially some mountains, and especially the windward side of mountains, and precipitates, right? It comes out, it rains or snows, and then that water can run off. Some of it gets into the ground and can flow underground. It might end up in a stream, and it might end up in a river and back in the ocean, or it might be end up as subsurface water, which could be an aquifer or subsurface flow, kind of along the same routes. And some of this water ends up in the plants and animals of a community. And it might actually, especially plants, there's a process called evapotranspiration. Hopefully I made that a vocabulary term for this module. And that's where the water leaves the tiny little holes in the plant's leaves and goes directly into the atmosphere. And that's a very important mechanism for moving water inside of a plant from the roots to the leaves, but also it ends up wasting, well, waste is probably not the right word. It ends up resupplying the atmosphere with water. And this is very important for tropical rainforests, as we'll talk about later. Okay, so that's one cycle. Another cycle, oh, it's the same picture, but here we're looking at carbon. So the same ecosystems, carbon is cycling in, and we've already talked about the link between photosynthesis and respiration. So I'm not going to belabor that point. But there's also a lot of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. It gets there from maybe volcanic activity or exchange with gas exchange on the ocean surface, for example. And there's photosynthesis and respiration happening in the ocean. And what else? Carbon can be sequestered in terms of, the cellulose that doesn't break down ends up in the soil, and it can end up in fossil fuels. Microbes might do something with it, or maybe humans come along millions of years later and dig it up and burn it as this, I don't want to use free, I don't want to use cheap, but we'll say easy source of energy to power our habitats and transportation and keep our homes warm and things like that. So those human emissions are adding to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and this has global consequences. And we will be discussing that quite a bit more during the last lab. Okay, another biogeochemical cycle. We will talk about the nitrogen cycle, mostly to say there's a lot of nitrogen in the atmosphere, but nitrogen is important. We need it for our proteins, right? Those amino acids require nitrogen. So there are nitrogen fixing bacteria like we saw in the communities lab, and those make the nitrogen available to terrestrial food webs, the plants and consumers and decomposers. And a lot of this nitrogen might end up in the soil if it isn't broken down and denitrified and put back into the atmosphere. Or some of this nitrogen might run off. There's these terrestrial food webs. We can actually use fossil fuels to make fertilizers from the nitrogen in the atmosphere. And then if we use too much of that, that can run off and have effects on the aquatic ecosystems in particular. Oh, I did have the phosphorus cycle. I'm going to skip this slide. Phosphorus is important, but we don't really need to talk about it. You can look at that picture if you are really interested. Okay, so how can humans affect and alter these natural biogeochemical cycles? Well, one way is called eutrophication. This just means true feeding, and basically it's caused whenever excess fertilizer runs off of agricultural systems, or if we have things like untreated sewage, which is a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus in that, which is effectively fertilizer. And then these aquatic producers are saying, oh, look at all this nitrogen and phosphorus. That's been our limiting resource for limiting nutrient. And now our population can explode, right? We've got plenty of nutrients now. So there's a bloom of algae or plankton or cyanobacteria or diatoms. Cyanobacteria are sometimes called blue-green algae, even though they're bacteria, and algae are eukaryotes, so they're protists. But in any case, yeah, they go wild, and your waterways end up turning green. Not just because St. Patrick's Day and someone threw a bunch of dye in here. This is chlorophyll, right? These are really happy producers for a while until those nutrients run out. And then when that happens, those producer populations, those photoautotroph populations, they crash and die. And then the decomposers go to work on all these dead algae or plankton or cyanobacteria cells or diatoms, which I guess are really kind of algae. But and then when that happens, dissolved oxygen in these aquatic ecosystems is depleted, and suddenly all the consumers die, which is not good. This happens in terrestrial waterways, and it also happens in, or I should say, freshwater ecosystems, and also in marine ecosystems. And in particular, You might have heard about these quote unquote dead zones off the Oregon coast. These are places where there's so many producers from the surface fall to the bottom and are worked on by decomposers, that the decomposers suck all the oxygen up from those areas, and the bottom fish and crabs die off in massive numbers, which means even more things for the decomposers to work on, and it takes a very long time for oxygen to return to those depleted areas. So it could be months, if not maybe a matter of years. So the dead zones on the Oregon coast have been getting bigger. They've probably always happened to some extent, but they have been happening more frequently and longer lasting and more and over a wider area lately. And part of that might be driven by excess nutrient runoff, and it also might be driven by warmer water temperatures, which is a result of climate change. Okay, so covered some of the nutrient cycles. Now we're going to get into the distribution of different ecosystem types, and these we call biomes. And so there are maybe 8 or 10 different biome types throughout the world, and usually we see similar biome types whenever the patterns of temperature and precipitation are roughly similar. And these are things like the tropical forests that we tend to see around the equator. That's warm, but a lot of precipitation. Then if it's a little less precipitation in those same areas, we might see savanna ecosystems, which are grassland ecosystems. If it's a little bit colder, we might have some, either temperate forests or temperate grasslands, or maybe some boreal forest, but that's kind of like the Douglas fir, the conifer forests, right? Would be that boreal forest. But maybe that gets a little more precipitation, but that precipitation is coming more in the winter months. So it makes sense for trees to keep their needles out. Well, I should say like fall and spring probably. Winter, it's maybe a little too cold for good photosynthesis and maybe too snowy. But winter and spring, there's plenty of water and plenty of light. Okay, what else have we got? Mountains we can see in certain areas, which are maybe kind of similar to the polar ice caps, these glaciated areas, like in Greenland or Antarctica. What else? We covered almost all of it. Chaparral is another interesting one. You see a lot of that around the Mediterranean, but also like California, maybe even parts of Southern Oregon, South Africa, Australia. That's kind of an interesting biome as well. Okay, so we'll go through each of these. Oh, actually, let's talk about the general pattern. So if we graph the annual mean precipitation for an ecosystem and the annual mean temperature, we can see some regions of this graph tend to have particular ecosystem types. So deserts are generally very warm, but there can be cold deserts as well, but very little rainfall in either case, for whatever reason. Grasslands maybe get a little bit more rain with similar temperature profiles. And if they're especially warm, we might call them savannas as those grasslands. Even more rainfall, but a little less heat, and we could have a temperate broadleaf forest like the oak, maple, hickory forests that you might find on the East Coast, or really east of the Mississippi. And if there's a little colder temperatures, it might be a coniferous forest, right? If it's even colder than that, the trees don't like to grow very well, so we're going to end up with tundra. And then very warm, very wet ends up as a tropical forest. Okay, so we're going to start with the tundra, usually found in the Arctic. There's usually not very many plants, plant species. It's like mosses, maybe some annual plants, maybe a few shrubs, but the trees, if they're around, they're very, very short. Most of the year, this is covered in snow, but it's not permanent snow. There's, it melts and kind of becomes boggy in the summer because there's so much daylight, and a lot of mosquitoes love this habitat. So visiting Alaska in the summer sounds like a great idea, except for so much daylight you can't sleep, and also so many mosquitoes you really can't be outside. The other thing is underneath the ground, it's so cold that there's a layer of permafrost. So that kind of traps the melt water. It really has no place to go. So that's why it becomes so boggy. And the characteristic animals, the consumers, we could have herds of caribou or musk ox roaming these areas and munching on the plants. All right, sorry, got interrupted there, but anyhow, yeah, so Arctic tundra, lots of flat, boggy, either snowy or mosquito-y. The next biome we're going to look at is a temperate grassland, sometimes known as prairie. And the characteristic plant communities are generally grasses and other, maybe perennial herbs, but maybe annual herbs. But in either case, not very woody, not very tall. These areas are not quite as cold as the tundra, but plenty of snow in the winter, cold winters, and warm, dry summers is kind of the characteristic. And one of the large grazing mammals that is historically been on these. Another interruption. Sorry. So yeah, bison. They are one of the possible primary consumers in this biome, but there's a lot of other large grazing animals that fill similar niches. And there's actually, you could argue, for some coevolution between the grazing mammals and the plant communities. Those are going to, the grazing mammals will keep the ecosystem as a grassland and supply fertilizer. And the plant communities provide food, and also they might have seeds that could be dispersed by these large grazing mammals. All right, some other terrestrial biomes. If we continuing with the grassland theme, if we add or if we increase the temperature even more, what is likely is a savanna. So it is a dry, or I should say warm, but kind of alternating between wet and dry. So there's the rainy season and the dry season. Temporary sources of water like watering holes are kind of a big feature of these types of ecosystems. And they might have large charismatic megafauna like giraffes or lions or gazelles or quite a few other potential large mammals. this is also kind of a savanna. I think this might be kind of, this one on the lower left might be from Australia, which also has savanna, and we could also find some savanna in South America as well. I would say, actually, if I back up a slide, the temperate grasslands in South America, they call them the pampas. So there might be local names for these general ecosystem types that are slightly different, but the biome is still the same. And I should also mention that the species in a given area might be unique, but it fits the general pattern for the type of ecosystem, the type of characteristic plant communities, and maybe it's different species of large grazing mammal, but they there are large grazing mammals present. So, okay, the next one, deserts. So if we get even warmer and especially drier, we can end up with a desert. We like to think of deserts as barren of all life, but that is simply not true. It's just that the plants have to be very, very well adapted to heat and drought. So hot and dry are all sorts of adaptations. It might be years before a significant rainfall in a given desert, and the life has to be able to survive that. So again, a lot of the water sources are underground, a lot of the animals are actually underground, and the plant communities are typically very, very, very drought resistant, and have unique dispersal mechanisms like tumbleweeds, or even I think certain species of cacti can kind of break off, and those pieces of cactus might disperse and 5 years later start growing again when they get a good rain. When it does rain in the desert, a lot of times you have these wonderful wildflower blooms from the seed bank that is just sitting there, just waiting for some rain. And again, this could be several years. Okay, I should also note about desert biomes is they tend to be more common about around 30 degrees north latitude or 30 degrees south latitude, because that's where the air current, like the global air circulation patterns, the hot, humid air coming up from the equator kind of spreads out as the circulation brings it towards the poles. And then when that rain precipitates out, it becomes dry. And as it cools off, it sinks down. Because of that, it's carrying very dry air around these 30 degrees north or 30 degrees south bands. So we tend to find a lot of them, and that's like Arizona, California, Death Valley, the Chihuahuan Desert in Mexico. There's a lot of deserts globally at that line of latitude. So, and the other thing that sometimes causes deserts are mountains. So if there's a mountain range that intercepts all the precipitation on the windward side, on the leeward side, the downwind side, as the air has shed its water coming up over the mountain, on the backside of that mountain, there can be deserts like Eastern Oregon, or I should say Central and Eastern Oregon tends to be very dry compared to the west side of the Cascades. And there are some actual deserts, like really not much plant life at all in the southeastern corner of the state, like the Alvord Desert is a good example on the leeward side of Steens Mountain. So if anyone's been down that way, you can see an actual desert. So, okay, but a lot of the deserts, the quote unquote deserts in Oregon are kind of high desert that are more of a kind of a cold desert, or kind of the edge between a temperate grassland and a desert. So, okay, this is a familiar picture. This might not be from around here, but this is the boreal forest, also known as taiga. And this is also known as coniferous forest. So a lot of trees that are cone bearing. The precipitation patterns are, generally warm, dry summers and cold winters, maybe snowy winters, but not necessarily always. But the fall and the spring, there's plenty of rain, plenty of moisture. A lot of these ecosystems are kind of fed by snowmelt for the water supply for these plants. So this is hopefully one we're familiar with and won't say too much more about it. Temperate forests. So this is kind of a typical Midwest to East Coast forest where you have deciduous trees because these ecosystems tend to be warm and rainy in the summer, kind of these daily thunderstorm events, and the water really doesn't go anywhere, it just evaporates back into the air and another thunderstorm the next day. So this is a temperate forest, and then during the winter, it's cold and dry. So it's kind of the opposite pattern of the opposite precipitation pattern for the taiga. All right, chaparral. This is an interesting one. Sometimes this is referred to as the Mediterranean biome, but we also see it quite a bit in California. I think this picture actually is from California. But kind of these scattered trees that are very drought resistant. Some shrubs, a lot of shrub type plants, a lot of drought resistant plants like succulents. So again, kind of edging between maybe a desert and a temperate forest, a lot of deciduous like oak trees and things like that, at least in the West Coast chaparral. But the interesting thing here is the precipitation patterns. It's very hot and dry in the summer, but cool and wet, not freezing cool, but fairly cool and wet in the winter. So they do get plenty of water. It's just there's kind of this rainy and dry season, and the water kind of has to last year round. So a lot of reliance on groundwater, a lot of plants that can get down into that supply of groundwater. Okay, tropical forest. There's actually a couple different kinds of tropical forests. There's kind of the monsoon forests, which might be a little bit more deciduous and kind of have this rainy and dry season and some seasonal precipitation patterns, even though the temperature doesn't change a whole lot. Or a tropical rainforest, which is basically gets plenty of precipitation year round. The biggest store of biodiversity anywhere is in these tropical rainforests. They're the most diverse biomes on Earth, and they, it might have 100 or several hundred different tree species in a relatively small area. So really these tropical forests, the communities there are products of competition. If you look at the soils are actually very low in nutrients because all of that is in the canopy. It's all above ground. And as soon as those dead, decaying plant and animal material hits the ground, there's a whole host of decomposers that quickly work on it. So there's really not much leaf litter to be found, very nutrient poor soils. And so when these biomes are cleared for agriculture, yes, there can be kind of this temporary influx of resources from the canopy, especially if they do like slash and burn type agriculture, but they're short-lived. It's maybe 10, 20 years that farm is productive, and then the soil, the nutrients are gone, the soils are depleted, and without more fertilizer, those areas are kind of bare and they're very slow to recover back into the tropical forest. All right, so I think that is our tour of biomes. It turns out most of these biomes we can find here in Oregon. So we maybe have a little more fine-grained view of biomes, but there's plenty of coniferous forest. We have some grasslands in the temperate grasslands in the Willamette Valley, and also on the east side of the state. There's some actual deserts and some kind of cold deserts, just east of the Cascades and some of the other mountains in southeastern Oregon down here. So the only things we really don't have are savanna and tropical rainforests. There's even some glaciated parts of the Cascades, which are maybe similar to the tundra, although they're, again, kind of unique because of their more temperate latitude. All right, so this is one way to look at the different ecoregions of Oregon. And actually, there's even more detailed classifications. I'm going to click this just because it's kind of neat to see. Oh, okay, maybe I won't. Maybe I won't. We'll leave it at that. But there is kind of a map of more detailed ecosystem types in Oregon that gets very fine-grained based on, each of these has like 20 or 30 different sub-classifications. So, okay, so these are the terrestrial biomes, the land-based biomes, but there are also biomes in aquatic and marine ecosystems. So our planet is mostly water, right? 70, or at least the surface, 70%, so over 70% water, right? About 3/4 of the planet is water on the surface. But very, very little of that water is fresh water. It's like maybe 3% or less than 3% is fresh water. So that would be the lakes, rivers, groundwater, glaciers, and permanent snow is most of that fresh water actually. We don't have a lot of water that's usable to humans, but all of these ecosystems are important. And they have their unique characteristic communities and kind of their quirks of, in terms of the nutrient and the temperatures and sunlight profiles. Okay, mostly all of this stuff is going to be covered by the guest lecture, but I do want to mention it here. So we have our freshwater ecosystems, could be glaciers and ice caps, streams and rivers, lakes and ponds, and wetlands, which are kind of the border between freshwater terrestrial or freshwater biomes and terrestrial ecosystems. And then there's marine, which essentially just means saltwater, right? And these saltwater ecosystems can be divided into the kind of the open ocean towards the surface. Well, I shouldn't say like this pelagic realm is, there's a picture and I'm gonna show it to you, even though it is, there we go. So there's the pelagic realm, which is everything except the bottom strata of the ocean, whether it's in the deep abyssal ocean or kind of more near shore. And then there's the Noretic zone, which is kind of the area where the deepest part isn't too deep. Like, so light gets all the way to the bottom, which is about 200 meters. And then there's the very near shore, which is the intertidal zone. So the area between low and high tide. So it's partly covered by water, partly not. And that's where those sea stars are doing their thing to keep the community structured. So, okay, so that is kind of the big picture. And then, the place where light can penetrate, a little bit deeper than that, and then really, really deep and cold and bizarre organisms live down here. Not hugely diverse, but Also, we know very, very little about it. We actually know more about the surfaces of other planets than we do the very deep ocean. So, okay. And then there's another type of aquatic biome where the freshwater and saltwater mix, and these are called estuaries. They're kind of these intertidal regions, the deltas of rivers like the Columbia River. There's an estuary there. If you go out to like Astoria and Warrenton, you can see some of the mud flats and tidal areas where the water comes in part of the time, but not all the time. So, okay. So the guest lecturer is going to get into this in more detail. I will stop talking now, and we'll see you for the next one.